As you sleep, you sway heavily, left to right. It's your tether to reality. As a crabber, you can't imagine life without it, until that tether pulls harder than it ever has. You spring from your bunk. It's difficult to stay on your feet. Everything keeps tilting. You literally must crawl up the narrow, turning staircase. You scramble to the bridge, to waves crashing across the deck, crab pots buried in ice, and the captain radioing Mayday. The vessel is seconds away from sinking. If your survival suit isn't on in seconds, you will die. In less than a minute, you went from where dreams are born to a nightmare that will define your life. The Scandies Rose, a 130-foot-long, 195-gross-ton steel fishing vessel, began her journey by Bender Shipbuilding in Mobile, Alabama, as the Enterprise in 1978. With bow plating 5/8 inches thick, hull and deck plating 1/2 inches thick, a wide deck, nearly flat bottom, and vertical sides, she was known as one of the safest fishing vessels to come to the West Coast, and was even featured on Deadliest Catch. In 1987, her name was changed to the Scandies Rose, a play on Scandinavian's flower. In 2008, 6 investors purchased the Scandies Rose. The half from Alaskan Leader Fisheries were bought out of their 50% share, leading the remaining 3 to found the Scandies Rose Fishing Company, comprised of Dan Madison with 50.2% of the shares, John Walsh with 19.8%, and Captain Gary Cobban Jr. with 30%. We must remind you that these stories are about real people, as remarkable as you or I. Understand who they were. They were Scandies Rose. Captain Gary Cobban was one of the most prolific fishermen in the Pacific Northwest. At 60, he lived a life of subsistence, catching shrimp, crab, cod, halibut, salmon, lobster, and swordfish. After crewing numerous vessels, he became an owner of the new venture and Scandies Rose. He mentored many captains and saved more than a handful of lives. The captain was accompanied by his 30-year-old son, David Cobban. Like his father, he grew up fishing, while also being an avid digital and tabletop gamer, going by Nova Agroth. During school, he fraternized with disabled children, shielding them from bullies. From the small Idaho community of Kellogg was Brock Rainey. A former Marine, he was known for his booming personality and irreverent humor. At 47, he was a father and grandfather, betrothed in his final days. The engineer of the Scandies Rose, 50-year-old Arthur Ganasius, was brought up between Sandpoint and Puget Sound, Alaska. Nicknamed Art, he loved cars, had no interest in marriage, and previously survived the sinking of the Denali. He understood the profession in ways those far older could not fathom. One of the newer additions was 31-year-old Seth Rousseau Gano, better known as Soren, from Silverdale, Washington. An experienced Dungeness crabber and black cod fisherman, he was a man of adventure. While not fishing, he was experiencing the world. He was enticed by the Scandies Rose safe reputation. These 5 were joined by John Lawler and Dean Gribble Jr. of Edmonds, Washington, who would tell their stories. It was the final week of 2019. Cod season and Apilio crab season was imminent on New Year's. The Scandies Rose was scheduled to set sail on the 30th through the Shelikof Strait toward False Pass, crossing into the Bering Sea. Already with a late start, a crew member dropped out. Gribble was called by Lawler on December 28th and immediately headed for Kodiak. The 7-man crew prepared for departure on December 29th, working into the night. 192 crab pots, below the capacity of 208, were stacked 5 pots high. They loaded up with provisions, including a stack of pizzas from Big Al's Take and Bake, a local favorite. After all material preparations were completed on the 30th, Cobban, a rigorous safety inspector, ran drills. He cautioned about inclement weather, with icing conditions from sea spray, which could accumulate on crab pots. At 8:35 p.m., the Scandies Rose departed from Kodiak Harbor. The wheel was manned in shifts. First, the captain for 6 hours, followed by each crewmate. At the end of a rotation, the relieved crew member would inspect the engines and auxiliary power. As Cobban's first shift ended at 2 a.m., the vessel transversed the Kupernoff Strait to the Shelikoff Strait. Between 6 and 8 a.m., Lawler and Gribble completed their shifts. They estimated an inch of ice had accumulated, though their perspective was through bridge windows, of which only 2 were heated. The journey had thus far been nominal, with only 2 waves transcending the bow. When Cobban was woken at 7:15 for his 8 p.m. shift, there was a 2-degree starboard list. Gribble questioned if the crew needed to break the ice. Cobban declined. Deck work would be perilous. He ordered Genesius to redistribute fuel to compensate for the list. Early in his shift, Cobban made calls to his ex-girlfriend Jerry Lynn Smith, as well as Matson, captaining the Amatuli towards Dutch Harbor for cod season. He mentioned icing and listing to both, but remained calm. With 2 inches of ice on the crab pots, he looked to drop anchor near Sutwick Island, 8 miles southwest. By 8:37, the list increased to 20 degrees. On the phone with his friend of 9 years and fellow fishing cooperative member, Oyston Lone, Cobban was leery about it and uncharted rocks between Sutwick Island and themselves. He still spoke casually, even about acquiring more shares in his vessel. Lone had cut it short, as duty called in the engine room. At 9:45, 2.5 miles from Sutwick Island, the Scandies Rose turned northwest. While merited for reaching the bay, this exposed the tilted vessel to willowaws. Lone called Cobban back. He was answered by a dire voice. Cobban lamented that the list had gotten a lot worse, and that he didn't know how it was going to go. The call cut out. At approximately 9:55, crew members were sleeping when the ship listed so far that Lawler and Gibble sprang out of bed. Lawler maneuvered up to the bridge. "What the fuck is going on?" Lawler bellowed. "What's going on?" "I don't know what's going on," Cobban replied. "I think we're fucking sinking." "No fucking shit, we're sinking." Lawler bolted back to the stairs. As Cobban radioed Mayday, Lawler shouted that the vessel was sinking. Gribble distributed suits to the crew. Against the tilting vessel, he struggled with getting his own on. He mounted the bench and used his armrest as a foothold. But when it was halfway on, the armrest snapped, sending him tumbling. Lawler struggled with his zipper jammed at the bottom. Gribble assisted. The Scandies Rose's list reached a near 90-degree angle. Captain Cobban slipped and fell, smashing into the portside wall. As he hollered in pain, his son, closest to the door, slid to his side, refusing to leave his father. Rainey was in his suit, but was trapped. Lawler climbed for the door. Someone grabbed his suit. "Help me, John, help me!" He pulled himself away and out. Gribble climbed out on his 4th try. An alarm sounded. Gribble tried to grab rope to throw down, but it was embedded in inches of ice. He could only look down and scream, "Get the fuck out of there!" The ship's generator went out, leaving it in darkness. A powerful wave swept them overboard. Gribble witnessed the Scandies Rose's final moments, her bow facing skyward, bobbing, before sinking to the depths below. For 20 minutes, Gribble and Lawler floated, contending with 30-foot waves and 50 to 60-mile-per-hour wind. The light of a life raft a couple hundred yards away inspired Gribble to swim over and pull himself in. Lawler spotted him and swam over. When he didn't have the strength, Gribble helped him in. A quarter-mile away, the light from a second life raft shined. It was hope that someone else had made it. Gribble and Lawler's beacon went out, so they sifted through the rising water in their raft for anything of use. Located flares, they ignited 4, believing rescue was imminent. The men attempted to keep their morale by quipping about the eventful New Year's Eve. Lawler tried to keep focused on his expected child and wife, but hypothermia was setting in. Hope was fading. If nothing else, they just wanted there to be bodies to bury. At 2 a.m., Lawler spotted a new light just above the sea. He croaked, Dino, I think I see something. Someone here." When they couldn't find the last flare, they used their suit's lights and waved them. Petty Officer 3rd Class Evan Grill's first rescue mission was off to a discouraging start. Nobody was in the first raft. Then a tap on his shoulder. A second raft, with lights waving. Time was short, with 20 to 30 minutes to spare. Grills was lowered down, swinging wildly. After being dunked in the salt water repeatedly, he extracted Lawler. When it was Gribble's turn, he was teased. "What took you guys so long?" To conserve fuel, the Jayhawk's auxiliary power was cut, leaving it without heating. At 3:40 a.m., it landed at the Coast Guard base Kodiak, where an ambulance rushed the men to the Kodiak Island Providence Medical Center in town to be treated for hypothermia. Gribble and Lawler were met by the Cobban family, anxious for answers. Realization set in. Gary and David were not the fortunate ones. Honoring his legacy, they pledged to support them in evermore. The Coast Guard combed a 1,400 square mile area, using in total 3 Jayhawks, 2 C-130s, and the cutter Mellon, which was slowed by her own icing. Kodiak held out impossible hope that the 5 were out there, that they swam through the tempest to Sutwick Island. But at 6:08 p.m., rescue operations were suspended. On January 30th, the Scandies Rose Fishing Company contacted Global Diving and Salvage to locate the vessel and survey the wreckage. Using the Endurance, an ice-class towing vessel, the expedition began on February 2nd. The Scandies Rose was located on her side on February 10th, flagged by a sheen of diesel floating on the surface. On February 11th and February 13th, the Endurance dispatched a remotely operated vehicle down to the wreckage. Investigation was precluded by debris. In the bridge, 2 bodies in immersion suits were found. Deadliest Catch aired a commemorative episode on February 12th, hypothesizing that the Scandies Rose was sunk by ice. With the survey still underway, it was criticized by families and friends for being presumptive. The show removed the episode from their website 4 days later. On June 29, 2021, the National Transportation Safety Board released the Marine Accident Report. They concluded that the contributing issues included the effect of extreme icing conditions, with 6 to 15 inches estimated to have accumulated, inaccurate stability instructions, the need to update regulatory guidelines on calculating and communicating icing for vessel stability instructions, and lack of accurate weather data for the accident area. Human error was not a factor. The crew performed exemplary and followed protocol to the letter. Unfortunately, with inaccurate safety instructions, even a legendary combo like Cobban and the Scandies Rose could only hold out for so long against such conditions. The NTSB made a series of recommendations to the Coast Guard, North Pacific Fishing Vessels Owners Association, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Weather Service to improve material support and practices to prevent another such disaster. In November 2023, the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard released a report concurring with most of the NTSB's recommendations. When it concerns matters of life and death, it does not end with the sinking of the ship or the rescue. To this day, debris from the Scandies Rose washes ashore. Much of it has been donated to the victims' families. Over the year and a half after the sinking, John Lawler was left with severe PTSD and depression, with debilitating anxiety. This was compounded further by the loss of his child. His battle ended on October 31st, 2021, when he lost his life in a motorcycle accident in Anchorage, Alaska. Now Dean Gribble is the lone survivor of the Scandies Rose.